All right, well, hello everyone. My name is Dustin Campo. I own a company called Justice Java that I started because of the employment discrimination that I faced coming back out into society after spending 5 years in prison here in Arizona, down in Florence, the Iman complex. I spent some time on a private yard. I spent some time on the state-run yards. So my knowledge is coming from my personal experience. Since I got out, I've been doing a lot of advocacy. I sit down with legislators and talk about the proposed legislation that can reform our systems. I volunteer with the ACLU. I'm on their Smart Justice Committee, which talks about their legislative agenda and what we're going to do moving forward, and also creates a platform for people who are formerly incarcerated to speak about their experiences. So that's a little bit about me. Tonight we're going to talk about, well, let me say this first, I am not an attorney. Nothing that I say should be interpreted as legal advice. Reach out to a lawyer for that, and my opinion does not necessarily reflect the opinions of the ASU or the ACLU or any of the other organizations that I mentioned. Tonight I'm going to speak about what crimes count as sex offenses. We're going to hear from a teacher that I interviewed while I was working with the ACLU. She worked at several different schools and taught sexual education. We'll hear more from her. We'll also hear a clip from a former judge that I interviewed, Judge John Leonardo. He worked on sex offense cases, and he has an interesting story about mandatory minimums and kind of a situation that he was put in where he had no judicial discretion and was basically forced to sentence somebody to 290 years, even though he disagreed with it. I'll share some of my knowledge about the sex offender registry and probation as it relates specifically to sex offenders. I'll talk about some polygraph testing and how that plays out. And then we'll talk about some of the health impacts of isolation, and that's going to be kind of in the context of solitary confinement, but I want you to think of these mental health impacts as reaching farther than that. It's most acute. We see it most strongly and significantly when somebody is in solitary confinement, but any kind of confinement or imprisonment can trigger these same types of issues. So let's ask a couple of questions of the room here. I would appreciate hands. If you're uncomfortable raising your hand, don't. How many of you had any form of sexual education before college? A little more than half the room, most of the room, I would say. How many of you felt that your sexual education fully prepared you for your healthy sexual development? Anybody felt that it was comprehensive? One person, understood. How many people in that sexual education were taught the concept of consent? About 5 of you, okay. And how many of you were taught about what would qualify as sexual abuse, misconduct, or what would actually be considered a sex crime? 0. That's the problem. How many of you were taught that about contraception or STDs? So about half of the people that took the sex ed, okay. And how many of you were taught abstinence or felt that that was like the main component of the sex ed? Okay, about 8 or 10. And then with that abstinence training or teaching, how many of you actually practiced abstinence? 0. So that is also the point. When sexual education breaks down, we fill in the gaps in other ways, and that might not always be healthy. So I'll be speaking more about that. Who knows somebody or they themselves have been incarcerated? Okay. Welcome to the class. Thanks for coming in. Okay, so what I'd like to say is that there are legitimately egregious examples of sex crimes. We have Jeffrey Epstein, we have Larry Nassar with what he did with the women's gymnastics team. We have legitimate cases of victimization, and I am not here to downplay any of those or lessen the severity of any of those, even when it comes to my crime and what I did. My concern is that everybody is being thrown into the same bucket, and by not being more careful on how we categorize people, we can be doing a disservice to ourselves, public safety, and the victims themselves. So those people that I mentioned are the reason that we have sex offender enhancements to the crimes that they commit. There's several enhancements. One is DCAC, a dangerous crime against children, and there are a number of other examples like that. So not all sex offenders are the same, and yeah, we're going to break that out a little bit more. So me personally, when I was a senior in college, I had sex with a young high school girl, and that happened one time, and for that I was arrested roughly a year later. I spent 10 months in county jails, right stone's throw from here in 4th Ave. I was there while I was fighting my case, and I eventually signed a plea that involved 3 charges. One of the charges, the sentence was 5 years of prison. The other 2 both had lifetime probation as the sentence. So I am currently sentenced to 2 terms of lifetime probation. We're going to explain why and how that works, because it's obviously confusing on its face, right? Now the 2 terms of lifetime probation include what's known as the sex offender addendum. You have the rules that apply to anybody that's on probation, and then we also have a separate set of rules called the sex offender addendum, which is several pages of additional rules and restrictions that apply to anybody in that bucket, whether it be irritating in public, indecent exposure, or forcible rape, or some of these more egregious crimes. I've taken about a dozen polygraph tests since my release. Annually, probation mandates that you take a polygraph test. We're going to talk more about that. So let's do a little bit of an overview of some of the statistics here in Arizona. We have the 5th largest prison population here in Arizona. That costs us $1.3 billion annually. And by incarcerating those people, not only are we losing out on that $1.3 billion that we're actively spending on them, but we're also losing $87 billion in what they would have contributed to the economy had they been out in society working, maybe under some form of supervision or probation, as opposed to incarceration. We have just over 35,000 people incarcerated in Arizona right now. And let's see.
I have a quick question that was submitted. That's okay. The annual polygraph test, what kinds of questions does that look like? What does that entail?
Yeah, I'm going to get into that
Okay,
in a lot more
perfect.
detail later in the presentation. I'll circle back to that.
Okay.
So let's start by what is a sex offender and what type of crimes did they actually commit. Now this includes adults that are having sexual relationships with minors, whether they be forcible or statutory, which means they consented, but because they're a minor, they don't legally have the right to give consent. So it's still not a consensual encounter. This can be any touching, groping, fondling, and every aspect of the contact can be broken out into a separate charge. So each different body part of yours that touched each different body part of theirs can be classified as a separate crime. Not only that, but there can also be intent or, attempted charges. So you tried to, but you didn't for one reason or another. Let's also speak specifically about what it means to be a pedophile. A pedophile is somebody who specifically has a sexual attraction to prepubescent children. These are people that have not gone through puberty, not in their adolescence yet, It is a very rare health diagnosis, mental health diagnosis. It is not what we see in the majority of sex offense cases. Other things that would qualify as a sex offense: forced rape, incest. Another one is kidnapping. All kidnapping charges imply a sexual nature, whether that be holding somebody against their will or however that plays out. So I know somebody whose son was in grade school, and they were horseplaying, I think it was in the cafeteria, and some of the boys held down one of the other boys, and they were charged with kidnapping, which has the sex offender enhancement to it, because they held him against his will. Now, this is something that kids do when they're playing. These are not people that we need to be throwing into the bucket with Larry Nassar and Jeffrey Epstein. Public urination, indecent exposure. There's another one a lot of people don't think about. If you have a 16-year-old daughter, or if you have a minor child and they take a picture of themselves, a nude selfie, they have just created child pornography. That is 10 years per picture, and really there's no leniency given there. There's no discretion in the sentencing. Judicial discretion breaks down, and we are stuck with what the prosecutor decides to charge and how that plays out. Usually in a plea. I'll speak more about plea bargains later. So because the nude selfie situation and other things, depending on where they send it, if they send it across state lines, now we can have interstate sex trafficking, interstate trafficking of child pornography. There's a list of crimes that they can be charged for by doing something that a lot of people do, especially adults. It's kind of part of normal, healthy sexuality. And yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about how the education system has prepared us for our healthy sexual development. I'm going to play the interview with Erin. Erin is the former teacher that I spoke of previously. And with that, I'd like to move on now to how the education system teaches and prepares our children for their, for the healthy sexual development of their life. I'd like to introduce Erin.
Thank you for having me. Hi.
Thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate your time tonight.
Of course.
So Erin was a former teacher in 3 different Arizona school districts. You're currently a grad student at U of A studying mass incarceration. You have seen your students and their parents in different situations being incarcerated in real time. And so I'd like to start off by asking you, how is sex education preparing teenagers for healthy sexual development?
It's a good question. And the truthful answer is that in Arizona, it's not. So our current state law does not actually require any sex education to be taught in schools at all. We're one of only 5 states in the United States that does not require a sexual education program. And those that it does permit districts to choose to have a sex education program, but in those cases, they must be abstinence oriented, which turns into abstinence only programming. There must be parental input and consent, and there needs to be an additional separate consent for any HIV information. The current programming that we have is very restrictive, and it's fear-based.
So apart from abstinence, what else is mandatory in the teaching? What are our sex educators required to tell our children?
In practice, what it comes down to is that each district develops a script, and that script really focuses on abstinence only, and it covers some STDs depending on the district. What it does not cover anything other than abstinence. It does not cover contraception, and that's really disallowed in most districts. It does not cover abortion or any non-intercourse related sexual activities among adolescents or adults. You can't vary from the script. when you're in the classroom talking to students about these. There are specific designated individuals on campus who are permitted to give these, and in some districts it's only the nurse, and there's very little time for any interaction or feedback to students for the questions that they may have.
How much time is there?
So in the 3 districts that I worked in, one of the districts, I was fortunate enough that they gave us 3 days a year, which turns out to be phenomenal. In a second district that I taught in, it was 2 days. And keep in mind that this is 1 class period per day. So it's about 40 minutes per day. So 3 periods per year for the one district, 2 for another. And then for the third district, it was 1 40-minute period per year that we were not allowed to interact with our students during that time.
So it can be less than an hour, but probably not more than 2 hours total over the span of 3 days. Now, when these classes are taught, are they taught co-ed, or are the children, is there a boys class and a girls class? How does that work?
We segregate them by gender, and it's really gender at the determination of the teachers and administration, right? We don't ask the students, we're not allowed to ask the students for their gender or where they prefer or feel comfortable being. So it is segregated. And the unfortunate part about that is that all students benefit from this information. Males, females, and gender diverse individuals will benefit from all the information and all the questions as well. So if the female class is asking certain questions, well, the males don't get to hear those, and vice versa. And so there's a lot of restriction going on in terms of how we educate and what we educate to our students.
And so is any gender identity, is there anything in that curriculum at all?
No. So previously, and there were some recent changes right now in 2021 in July, our governor signed into law some new legislation that makes some substantial changes to the laws regarding sex education. Now, before, we were not permitted to talk about, in any of the districts that I've been in or any that I know of, we were not permitted to talk about LGBTQ IA plus issues to any extent. The new legislation that was signed into law by Governor Ducey restricts that further. And so one of the things that does is it requires notice and parental pre-approval for any discussion of sex-related material outside of sex ed classes. The broad requirement would block discussions of historic events that include court rulings on gay marriage, as well as any civil rights related legal issues for LGBTQIA plus individuals. So it's gone even more restrictive than it was prior.
So even outside of the specific time for sex education, if something like that were to come up in a civics class on the history of our country, that would also be omitted from that curriculum as well. Is that correct?
That's correct, unless you obtain opt-in from every single parent of every single student. And that's one of the big changes in this current legislation. So before there was an opt-out, right? So if parents didn't feel comfortable with the information being taught, then that's their choice and they can opt out, and that's fine. The change now is that it's an opt-in system, and all districts have to be compliant by December 15th of this year. And that's going to disproportionately disclude a lot of students, particularly students of color and students who live in low income areas, students whose parents maybe aren't home that night to send home the permission slip to sign it back and bring it back. It's going to pose a huge barrier to a lot of students who really want and really need this education, and they're not going to be able to participate because they're making a case for parental rights when really we're ignoring the rights of the child.
Understood. So shifting back to specific sexual education, when important issues are left out, the children aren't just going to stay in the unknown. They're going to try to fill in these gaps in the information. Do you have any knowledge on how they go about filling in those gaps?
Absolutely. Adolescents are curious, and we want them to be. We want them to look for information, to seek out that information. But when we don't give them the correct tools or the correct information, they're going to go looking on their own. So they're going to acquire information through their friends, through social media, or through the internet. So it's going to be misinformation, disinformation, or assumptions. And they're not going to be able to access they're really not going to be able to access the appropriate tools on their own, right? So if they went to WebMD or if they went to, a site that's going to give scientifically accurate and medically relevant and culturally sensitive information, a lot of those terms even used on those websites are not going to be really accessible to those students, right? They're going to go to sites that are going to have terminology that they're more familiar with. They're going to ask their friends, they're going to go on social media, and then they're going to end up on porn sites, and that's where they're going to be getting this information to help them make critical life decisions.
Well, I don't think that's where we should be getting our information from. That's probably not a solid foundation for healthy relationships. So, yeah, is there anything else related to that that you would like us to be aware of?
Yeah, just that with abstinence-only sex education, a recent study about a decade ago showed that abstinence-only sex education has shown not to reduce the risks of sexual intercourse among teens or teen pregnancy or STDs. We need comprehensive sex education. We also need to be having more conversations about what consent is and what consent looks like, not just in sexual education, but through all grade levels at all the time. So what is safe? What is not safe? What is okay for me and what is okay for you? There's a lot of misconceptions that children have, that adolescents and youth have, that really affect their decision making, right? Like some of the things that I've heard students ask are, is it true that if you're under the influence that consent is assumed? And no, that's not true. Another thing that students have asked is, well, boys or men can't be sexually assaulted, they can't be raped. Well, no, that's not true. We know that that's not true. Or you can't get pregnant or STDs in certain sexual positions. We know that these are false. So our kids do want information and they want to make good choices for themselves, but we need to help them with that.
That's great information.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you very much, Erin. We appreciate you.
So was there anything that Erin said that anybody finds factually inaccurate? Anything that she said that's just blatantly wrong? That's good to hear. Is there anything that she said that people just disagree with?
It's okay if you want to disagree.
Yeah.
Just so you know,
yeah.
you can disagree or agree, whatever.
Well, that's good as well. I think she did a really good job of covering a lot of the topics there. And yeah, I'm really grateful to her. She reached out to me actually about all of that to give her, put in her 2 cents. And I think it really added something to the conversation. So one of the things I mentioned is how they can stack charges. Each different aspect of the sexual encounter can be broken out into its component parts. What they use to do what they use this for is to leverage a plea bargain. So they'll say, if you want to reject the plea, which is for 5 charges, you'll spend 30 years in prison. Then what we're going to do is we're going to take you to trial, and there will be 10 charges or 12 charges, and you'll spend the rest of your life in there. That's what I was facing. First, they offered me a plea for 10 years flat. I would have gotten out last year if I would have signed that. Instead, I got out in 2015. The second plea that they offered was 3 charges, 5 years, and the 2 terms of lifetime probation. If I would have rejected that plea, I was facing 11 charges that I would have faced in court in a trial, and they had about 140 years when you added up all of the mandatory minimums. So I would have been in there for natural life.
Why do they do that?
To leverage a plea. 95% of all cases are resolved by a plea bargain. The prosecutor has you up against a wall and backed into a corner, and they say, you're gonna do it this way, or we're gonna do it this way. Your choice. But is that really choice? I don't think it is.
Does Arizona have a statute of limitation when it comes to age? So like, let's say an 18-year-old had sex with a 17-year-old, like, is that still illegal, or?
I believe there's a Romeo and Juliet law that would allow that to be legal if they're within a certain number of years of age, or if the relationship had been long-standing. So let's say they started when she was 15 and he was 16, and now 17 and 18, like you said. I don't believe there would be a crime involved there, as long as they're close in age. Mine obviously was not. Yeah, that answer your question? Yeah. Anybody else? Anything? So, let's see. So by effectively wholly criminalizing teenage sexuality, we have the fate of our children is being left up to prosecutorial discretion. When we have these mandatory minimums that a judge cannot sidestep, bypass, override, when you sign that plea, because of the leverage that they had against you, you kick the judge out of the conversation. So what I'm going to play now is a conversation with a judge that I had, and he's going to talk about that case that I mentioned earlier.
Yes, hi, sir. Thank you so much for being with us. This is Judge John Leonardo. He's a former prosecutor that became the Pima County judge. And he's here to speak with us about mandatory minimums. How are you this evening, John?
I'm fine, thanks.
Good, good.
And good evening to everyone.
What would you like to tell us about mandatory minimums?
Well, first, I want to commend you all for having the discussion you are tonight, shining the light on these issues. It's helpful. We need more of that.
Thank you.
What I would say is that I was 20 years on the Pima County Superior Court bench. And during that time, I had to impose some sentences that were higher than, more severe than I thought were appropriate. But there's one case that was particularly egregious. Dustin and I have discussed this before, and give this as an example. It's the worst case I was ever involved in the 20 years in terms of a disproportionate sentence. The facts of the case were it was about a 42-year-old man who was employed as an aviation mechanic. He was self-sustaining. He had an apartment by himself. And he had no criminal record other than about a 10-year-old possession of cocaine charge. And he allowed a friend of his who was in desperate need of someplace to stay for a few days to be in his apartment with him. And that person, while he was staying there, was arrested and charged with auto theft. And in an attempt to avoid the consequences of that charge, he told the police that his roommate had some child pornography in his apartment. There was a search warrant. The police entered and they found a box of images that had been copied. They were paper images copied off of the internet that included child pornography. So there were 29 images. They charged him with all 29. The prosecution offered no plea agreement. This man offered to plead guilty to 2 charges. That was denied and ignored. So he had to go to trial, and he was convicted of all 29 counts. And then, as Dustin has alluded to earlier, this particular statute in Arizona requires a mandatory minimum of 10 years in prison for each image. So I had no alternative to give a lower sentence than what I imposed, and that was 290 years in prison. You know, many times a life sentence, and I had no other alternative. This is the most humane and shocking sentence that I ever had to impose. And the man, of course, is still in prison, and I'm making attempts with some others to file a petition for commutation to get him released, but that requires going through a commutation commission, and even if they agree that he should be released, it has to be approved by the governor. So it's a very political act to take, and the chances of success are not terrific. But the trouble with this sentence, of course, it's undefensible in a rational way, because this is somebody who received a heavier sentence than if he had killed the child, where the minimum sentence possible would have been life, no release or parole before 25 years, a lot less than 290 years. if he had actually molested a child or abused a child or kidnapped a child, the penalty would have been, that he would have been facing would have been much less.
So he
And
would have been facing less time if he would have actually committed murder against one of those children. And to your knowledge, any of those pictures in his possession, did he take any of those, or were those ones that he found that somebody else had taken?
no, that's the other thing about this. Although he only he downloaded these pictures, he possessed them for his own use. He didn't share them, he didn't create them, he didn't sell them, he didn't import them, he did none of those things. Yet all of those acts are covered by the same law and face the same range of sentence. All of those acts are the same in terms of the law. And, you know, some people, you got to wonder about what the damage this kind of offense does to society. What is it we're trying to prevent? And for someone like this who does only what he did in the limited way that he did it, there's the argument, well, if people didn't download pornography, child pornography, then it wouldn't be created, it wouldn't be sold, it wouldn't be transferred from person to person, and therefore people wouldn't create it because there would be no demand for it. But, you know, that's really the same argument as you can use for narcotic drug offenses. You know, simple possession of a narcotic drug, well, if people didn't use it, didn't buy it, didn't possess it, there would not be the market, there wouldn't be the cultivation, the importation, the organized crime around it. That's all true, but that's very removed from a direct victimization of a person, a particular person. And in the drug scheme, sentencing scheme, you have vastly different sentences that are available between somebody who is simple possession of drugs versus someone who sells it or imports it or grows it, as it should be. Those are different culpabilities, but under this child pornography statute, there is no difference. So when I had to impose that sentence, I felt like instead of being an agent of justice, which I had generally been as a judge, I was forced to be an agent of injustice. And instead of independent and unbiased judgment, which is mostly what was expected of me as a judge, I was expected instead, in this case, to be a cog and mandatory injustice. Fortunately, that didn't happen a lot, but as I said, this is the most egregious example, and it stayed with me now 15 years. Until I say recently, as a judge, I couldn't really do anything about it because I had to follow the law. That's the oath that you take as a judge, of course. But now that I'm retired, I think this is something that I'm trying to address. But of course, the petition to commutation only affects this man. But what we really need to worry about is what about everybody else? This law is still in effect. So we need to, going forward, we need to make a change in this legislation. It's an embarrassment to the criminal justice system.
I couldn't agree more, John. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with us this evening?
No, I don't think so.
Well, I really appreciate you being so generous with your time. Your perspective has been very enlightening, and I hope people have gotten a lot out of it. Thank you so much, John.
So that man has one of the most gravelly voices I've ever heard in my entire life. He could narrate an apocalypse movie and win an Academy Award. But because that voice is a little gravelly, I want to recap what he said. There was somebody with 29 pictures of children. They were not offered a plea by the prosecution, so they didn't even try to use that leverage that they have to get him to sign a piece of paper. It seems in this case, instead, they wanted to make an example out of him. I feel like that's why they didn't offer a plea to him at all. I could be wrong, but there must be some legitimate reason why they broke the pattern, because that's what they do. We could take you to trial, charge you with all 29 pictures, and you will spend the rest of your life in prison, or you can sign this plea. That sounds like the definition of the leverage that they use against people all the time. So and the fact that the judge is going back to try to get commutation on the sentence to get something changed because he was cut out of the loop, he was cut out of the decision-making process in this case, just shows a little bit of the power imbalance that exists in the system. Any questions about what Judge Leonardo said?
So why do you believe that people who possess pictures get charged more than people who actually like kill somebody or different things along that line? Why do they get charged differently in more time?
If I kill you, I can only kill you once. If I want to take an inappropriate picture of you against your will, I can do that over and over and over and over again, depending on the circumstances. So I think that's a big part of it. We also don't have any existing legal framework, to my knowledge, that says this is the mandatory maximum. You can't sentence above that. You can't give somebody 290 years just because you stacked a bunch of charges. We don't have anything prohibiting any of the bad actors in the system, the prosecutors or even the judges in some cases. He's a good one, they're not all. So we really don't have guardrails. We don't have buffers to make sure that everybody stays within the lines. In my case, one of the reasons that they were able to leverage a plea against me is because in order to get the indictment, so there's two different ways that you can get charged. Cop sees you doing something, they write you a ticket, that's a charge, you have to fight that in court. Or a prosecutor can say, we think he did this thing that's illegal. So what you have to do is go before a grand jury. This is a kind of a mock jury, it's still a jury of your peers, but the only person who gets to present any evidence to them is the prosecutor. There is a statute that says they are required to let you be present, even though and I tried to exercise that right and I was denied. They refused to transport me to court when they were doing that. So what my prosecutor did was say they had a confession from me. They did not. I know better than that. My best legal advice to anybody, even though I'm not a lawyer, use that right to remain silent. Everything that you say will be used against you in ways that you cannot possibly imagine. Lawyers, cops, I've spoken with so many people that say, don't talk to them. No good can come from that if you engage in that conversation. You can't talk yourself out of having just committed a crime. Be like, hey, buddy, let's just look the other way. Let's not write that one up. It just doesn't go down like that. Did that fully answer your question?
Thank you.
Yep. All right. So you've been arrested, convicted, you served your prison time, now you're coming back out into society. What that entails, you have a paper trail, you have whether or not you're on paper. So it can be probation or it can be the registry. You can get off lifetime probation. I have tried twice to petition the judge to early terminate my lifetime probation. So if we terminate the lifetime probation, there are 2 terms of lifetime probation. I would get off of both of those if the judge agreed and let me off. If I said, I don't want to do probation anymore, forget it, just violate me, send me back to prison, I'll do however much time I gotta do, I'm done dealing with probation and their garbage. That's when the 2 comes into play. So to go back and kill your number on a lifetime probation is usually a 5, 10, 15. So if there's some circumstance, like maybe you were the victim of a sexual assault when you were a child, and then you victimized somebody else, but that's kind of you acting out because of the trauma that you experienced, they might mitigate that sentence down and you would do 5 years. Normally, the middle one, the 10 years, that's what you normally get. And then if it's something particularly egregious, multiple victims, or something just really blatantly, obviously bad about what you did on top of just the normal charge, they can enhance the sentence, that would be the 15. So if I wanted to kill my number, I wouldn't be looking at a 5, 10, 15, I'd be looking at a 10, 20, 30. What they do with those 2 terms is they stack the sentence. Sometimes you can run it concurrent and you do both of the 5-year sentences at the same time. Sometimes they'll stack them, you do 5, then you do the other 5. So a 5, 10, 15 becomes a 10, 20, 30 in that way. Did that make sense? Did I land that plane? Okay.
How did it feel like coming back?
That's a good question. Not great. It was very difficult. One of the things that I've been trying to tell people about that have loved ones who are incarcerated, they say, oh, he's coming home in a year. He's coming home in 2 years. I say, when he gets home, he will probably have anxiety issues, not just because of the trauma and everything in there. There are certain things that you just do every day at the same time every single day. And one of those is get counted. Several times a day, you go back to your bunk, you sit there, you wait while the correction officers come through, look at you, look at your name tag, and do that with every single person in the pub. And then they report those numbers, somebody tallies them all up. If everybody is accounted for, then you're kind of unlocked and you can go back to what you were doing. It gets into your biological clock. Like it just gets in there somehow, and it's so hard to break it. So you'll get out and you'll be driving down the road happy hunky-dory, and then all of a sudden you get this like, I've got to be somewhere right now, and I don't know where it is, and I don't know how to get there, and I don't know what to do, but I'm not supposed to be here, and I don't know. So you just kind of start losing your shit because you're having a panic attack. Because if you were on the inside and you were out of place, not only are you looking at a ticket from the guards, and they can take away your good time, and they can take away your privileges, and they can take away your TV, and they can take away whatever they want to take away, your visits, your phone calls, they can take it all away. On top of that, if you're at a place and let's say the yard gets locked down because you were out of place, don't worry about what the guards have to say about it, because now you got to face all the other inmates that you're locked in there with. So it's this threat to your life from 2 different angles that has been going on for years to you, that's so ingrained in you that once that is gone, you still feel it. It doesn't go away just because the imposition is gone. So that's one example of the kinds of patterns that get built into a person that don't break just because you walked out the door. And there are a number of other examples of things like that. So coming back out is hard. I'm going to get a little bit more into that in a few. So the registry itself, let's talk about the sex offender registry, then we'll go on to the probation terms, the sex offender addendum, then we'll talk about isolation. Oh, you know what I didn't ask? I'm curious, how many of you had an information gap in the sex education history that you were taught and said, oh, I can probably just figure that out by looking it up online, and it took you pretty much straight to a porn website? Did that happen to anybody that's comfortable just acknowledging it? I don't need the details, I'm just curious. A couple of people that has happened to. So that legitimately happens. All right, so back to the registry. Anybody want to take a guess how many people are on the sex offender registry in the country?
Just guess someone. Throw a number.
Throw out a number. How many?
3 million?
3 million. It's lower than that.
150,000.
It's more than 150,000. So we're right around 1 million. We just went from 800,000 to over 900,000, and that number is still growing. So we've hit close to 1 million people on this sex offender registry. One bucket with all those names in there. And then you give it to a cop and say, make us all safe. And the cop says, what am I supposed to do with 1 million names? What do you want from me? And I've got to report to the car accident that just happened, so I can write a report from them, and the burglary, and the this, and the that. So even law enforcement is complaining that they can't do anything with the registry because the bucket's too big. They don't even know who they should be looking at. Yes, they have tiers and risk levels and different tools to try to figure out who's the worst among us. But almost all of those are devoid of empirical, statistical, like, if this person is A, B, or C, then they are this likely to recidivate. So law enforcement doesn't know what to do with it. The stacked charges and the prosecutorial discretion that overrides judicial discretion means you could have people on multiple terms of lifetime probation that don't necessarily need to be there. It's just more resources that we're throwing good money after bad.
Does it follow you from state to state?
It does change state to state, yeah. Does the what change state to state?
So if you're registered in Arizona and you go live in Michigan, does it follow you to Michigan?
Oh, you just opened Pandora's box. All right, so, okay. What is the sex offender registry? A lot of people think it's one law. Oh, it's Megan's Law. Oh, it's the Adam Walsh Act. Oh, it's the Jacob Wetterling Act. No, it's all of them. All of these different pieces of legislation that have been passed over the years have kind of been amalgamated into what are known as SORNA laws, S-O-R-N-A, Sex Offender Registry Notification something. So it's not just one thing, and it's not uniform. So if I wanted to move, so if probation can tell you when you're allowed to move or not, they have to pre-approve it if you're moving. Let's say that the judge granted my early termination and I don't have probation anymore. I just have to deal with the registry. That registry, the way it's enforced in different states is different. So I might have a 3-day buffer where as long as I'm not staying in your state for more than 3 days, I can kind of come and go. Vegas, you want to go to, if I want to go to Vegas right now, the second I cross the city line, I have to go straight to the sheriff's office and say, hi, I'm a sex offender, I'm here, and you basically have to register where you are. So it can vary from the second you walk in the door to, you may have 3 days, you may have 10 days, you may have a certain amount of time before you're required to notify law enforcement. And how you notify them can be different and all of that. So with those complications, we have something called an FTR, a failure to register. So you didn't follow those rules properly. So now here's a new charge. You're starting all over in the system, all over again. FTRs are pretty much a 2-year sentence, no matter what. While I was in there for 5 years, I saw dozens and dozens of people that were coming back on an FTR. They're in, they got 2 years, and then they're back out. If they had completed probation and then got an FTR, they may be sentenced again to a new lifetime probation. They may literally have to start the whole thing over again. And probation isn't just probation. A lot of times that comes with mandated treatment and therapy. So mine was, it did, and I was in treatment and therapy for about 5 years before I successfully completed it. If I were to get off of lifetime probation and then move and not tell anybody, or even stay where I'm at and just forget to sign the new thing every year that they give me, that could be an FTR. I'd have to go back, do my 2 years, come back out, start lifetime probation all over again, start treatment and therapy all over again, ask the judge for an early termination again after I meet this whole huge checklist of criteria. It's a nightmare.
I just want to make a quick comment because as most of you in this class know, I've been reading through all of like Epstein's search warrants, his affidavits, all of this stuff, right? And he failed to register several times in New York City, Florida, other places. It's just, I'm sure maybe I'll have more questions later on this, but like, it is frustrating to me that someone like Epstein, who doesn't do that, he never served those, but people who might make a simple mistake, not signing right, whatever, can't, they will end up in prison for another 2 years, when monsters like Epstein don't actually follow through with that.
Yep, and they just get to walk
And it
around.
doesn't matter.
Yep. So that speaks to the disproportionate application of it. This is why we see that in Arizona, Black Americans are 5% of our state's population, but they're 18% of our incarcerated population, and 18% of our jail population, and 14% of our prison population. What's the difference between jail and prison? Jail is typically where you're held pre-sentence while you're fighting your case. So you weren't allowed to get out on bail because they didn't offer you a bail. They said you didn't qualify for it, and they said you're just not allowed to be out on bail. We're just gonna hold you. That's jail. After you lose your trial, sign your plea, whatever it may be, after you lose and you're sentenced to prison, that's when prison comes into play. If your sentence is less than a year, they may keep you in jail. So if you have a really short sentence, you may not go to prison. You may go back to jail to serve that short amount of time and then be released back out into the community from jail, never having set foot in prison. Doesn't happen often with sex offense cases because the sentences are so long, but there's always an example. Let's see. Any other questions about? Yeah, go for it.
I have to ask, is it true that once you come out as a registered offender that you have to tell all your neighbors that you are a registered offender before you move into a new home?
Great question. So that's a notification, community notification. That's gonna depend on your risk level. There's 3 tiers. I believe only the top highest risk tier has to notify. You don't necessarily have to do that. You will just get flyered where they just mail all your neighbors your picture, enumerate your crimes and all of that. So even if you are required to, or even if you must notify, even if you fall into that risk level, you may not actually be the person going knocking from door to door. Knocking door to door would actually violate one of your probation terms. If I just wanted to go up and down my neighborhood knocking on doors saying, hey, I'm your neighbor, how have you been? I'm not allowed to do that. They break it down in all these weird ways in the probation terms. Yeah, did that answer it?
Yeah. Do you guys have a co-probation officer?
No. So I just got done having a terrible probation officer. They kept me on her caseload because I was trying to file for early termination of my probation. So until that had been wrapped up with the judge, even though I moved into somebody else's territory where I would have just been switched to a new person's caseload, I was kept on the old team's caseload until the judge made a decision. I strongly disagree with the judge's decision. When I filed my early termination motion, I had about 13 letters of recommendation from state senators, the town council members, somebody who worked for Boeing, somebody that was an engineer in Silicon Valley for a number of years, just everybody that you would want to be on your side for something like this. And the judge said, wait, do one more polygraph test. It was a wait of about 3 months. He said, do your new polygraph test. Then I want to hear from probation. Then I want to hear from the prosecutor's office who originally sentenced you in the first place. Then you get another chance to say whatever you want to say. Then I will set a hearing, rule in your favor or deny. So he said, do all these things, and then we'll see. I passed my polygraph test, and my probation officer, who was pretty bad, actually endorsed my early termination. She said, I think he's a good candidate for early termination. As awful as she was, I couldn't believe that she said it. I was blown away. I said, yes, finally I'm getting off of probation. It's gonna happen. Nope, he still denied it. So my question is, why did you want to wait for the polygraph test if it didn't matter if I was going to pass or fail? Why would you want to hear from these other people if it didn't matter whether they endorsed me or not? Why? Just to drag out the system, just to keep me on probation. It's a money thing, and I'm going to break down the money in a minute. You then you.
What does the polygraph do? Like, what do they ask you?
Yep, that's my next section. We're pretty much there.
It's good that you're asking questions.
It is. You guys are right in front of me, and I'm gonna get there in a minute. I'm gonna hold off on that question.
Are
Was
you
yours?
allowed to ask why they denied, your request?
No. So that's why this one was my second attempt to try to get off of probation, because often people say your first request is almost certainly gonna get denied. But the judge will usually say, no, because this, here's why. So then you can kind of focus on, do I need to get better at paying my probation fees? Do I need to get better at this? What do I need to do so that the judge can't make that complaint again? So that's why I filed way early. I filed after like 4 years on probation. I was still in treatment. There was no way they were gonna say no, or there was no way they were gonna grant it. So I at least wanted to know why. He didn't tell me why. And they didn't tell me why on the second one either. So even though I had been told that by public defenders, other people that had been on probation, former judges, former whatever, it didn't matter. It didn't play out like that. In fact,
On average, how much would you say like probation fees are?
I have a breakdown of all of that that's coming in a moment. So let's skip ahead and get to where you guys are now.
I got a
So,
quick one.
yeah,
Okay, I'm curious now. So like, you've been rejected constantly. Could there be a point to where you could say, okay, this could just be because of what I stand for and have tried to do, this is the reason you guys are rejecting me, and I'm putting that on trial? Does that make sense?
yes. So you're not denying me on the merits, you're denying me because of some kind of bias or prejudice
Yeah,
or
makes
something.
sense. Yeah, exactly.
You just don't have a leg to stand on unless they incriminate themselves in a court document. If they say,
It's like you gotta have something that without a shadow of a doubt you could prove what your claim is gonna be.
Yeah.
And get you.
because of the nature of my crime, they used it to permanently sever my parental rights with my daughter. My crime had nothing to do with my daughter. I have never met my daughter. I haven't seen her since she was 1.5. Her mom took her, moved out to Chandler, gave nobody any forwarding information, and I never saw my daughter again. Then while I was in prison, the mom started to write to me. Sounded like we were on good terms. We were never gonna get back together or anything like that, but here's some workability. Here's something that here's a conversation that we can build on, that we can use towards just having a family so that my daughter can know her father. As soon as that started to come up through probation and whatnot, the state immediately filed to have my parental rights permanently severed, and they won.
It was the state?
Yes. Yeah, it was DCS specifically who made that happen. I'm bitter. I'm very bitter about that. FTR's 2 years, we did that. Oh, that quote. So even though we have some progressive and liberal voices in some positions of power right now on like the national level and whatnot, like Chuck Schumer. I like Chuck Schumer. I think he's doing good work in the Senate right now. So he said once, sexual offenders are different. No matter what we do, the minute they get back on the restless and unrelenting prowl for children, innocent children, to molest, abuse, and in the worst cases, to kill. So this is somebody who should kind of get what the real nature of sex offenses is. What is the actual recidivism? How likely are we to reoffend? 95% of all new sex cases, new sex offenses are committed by people who are not on the registry. After, we're gonna play this next clip. So we have children as young as 8 that are being put on the sex offender registry. I'm gonna show you this graph first and then I'll play the video to kind of give you a sense of it. This is your age profile of sexual offenders. So, this is your rate per 100,000. So we have 8-year-olds, about 4 per 1,000 of offenders are 8 years old. These are kids that are being put on the sex offender registry for the rest of their life with no pathway to get off of the registry. Go for it.
What does a crime that they can get an 8-year-old look like? Like what Because you gave an example like teenagers sending like nude photos and stuff.
Sure,
What?
exactly that.
Oh, okay.
Yep. Creating child pornography, inappropriately touching a brother or sister. I mean, it can be any of the sex crimes that I enumerated before. It can be the horseplay and holding down.
Revenge porn is one that's newer, but coming up, like, if someone receives a photograph and then shows it to anyone else or passes it to their friends, that's considered revenge porn,
Wow.
and that's,
It's like I have some homework tonight too. Go ahead.
So for child pornography, you're talking about how they get charged per picture. Is it the person that takes it or the person that receives it that gets charged?
Person who's in possession of it and gets caught in possession of it. If they can say, yeah, you have it, but this person took the picture, you're both going down. If they can trace it back, obviously the goal is to trace it back to the most egregious offender, who is victimizing children, making them be naked under whatever circumstances and taking pictures of them. All of those, the breakdown of all the different ways that they break out the crime, I completely agree with it in that situation. Yes, each different aspect of that making them not be, taking off their clothing or whatever, because there's almost always some kind of manipulation involved in that. Oh, let's play a game where we run around and we pretend that we're dogs and cats or whatever, right? Like there's some really sick manipulation involved in some of those. Yeah, did I answer your question? Cool.
What happens to the 8-year-olds? Do they go to jail or what?
They can. My nephew stuck a Q-tip in an inappropriate place on his stepsister, and he's on the registry. He got pulled out of the home and put in a group home, so he never really got charged or sentenced. It's more like DCS came in and just kind of said, okay, we're taking control of the situation and dictating who's going to be where, under what circumstances, and how this is going to go. But he essentially went into a group home for youthful sex offenders, youth sex offenders. So if we look at the most people who are being charged, added to the sex offender registry, this is the highest rate per capita right here, it's 14-year-olds. Why do we have a system for notifying the public? Now, originally the registry was just for law enforcement view and use only. They were the only ones that were allowed to see it, access it, have the information. I think it was illegal for them to give out that information to the public. There were some guardrails on it. If the goal is public safety, how are we protecting the public from 14-year-olds? If it's just picture things or even consensual. It can be consensual between a 14-year-old and another 14-year-old, but because what you did to the other 14-year-old is a crime against a minor, you weren't allowed to do it in the beginning anyway, because they can't give consent. You'd almost have to ask their parents if you could do it to them. Yeah, it's this ridiculous, I can't put my finger on it, but I'm hoping my point is going to get across. So that's down. And the registry is for life. There are almost no mechanisms legally by which you can get off the registry. It's pretty much permanent. So with that, let's move on to how big of a risk are sex offenders? How likely are they to go on and commit a new sex offense crime? We know that recidivism across all crimes is about 60%. Some say 66, somewhere it's in that range. So about 2/3 of people that are arrested, charged with a crime, and get sentenced are going to do something else again, whether it be a property crime, vandalism, whatever it may be, grand theft auto. The only other crime that has as low as a recidivism rate is murder, because either we can't track it because you got away with it and you murdered a bunch of people, but we don't know who it is, so we can't say that that person recidivated because we never caught them, and we can't put all the pieces together because we just don't have all the information. Or that we catch them and that's it, you're doing life, you're done. So we rip them out of a circumstance where they can possibly do it again. So it makes sense why murder has such a low recidivism rate, because of either an absence of information or the maximum amount of punishment that we can dish out. So we're somewhere in the middle.
Megan's Law will protect millions of families.
In a few moments, I will sign the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act.
President Obama signed the International Megan's Law bill into law on
The sex offender registry and other things that are imposed on sex offenders are justified by the fact that they have a frightening and high reoffense rate. As high as 80% of sex offenders reoffend, and that's a frightening and high rate. If 80% of sex offenders reoffend upon release, that would be frightening and certainly very high.
There is a huge disparity between the public's perception of sex offenders and the truth, the empirical, scientific, actuarial truth.
In explaining this frightening and high reoffense rate, Justice Kennedy made reference to a manual published by the United States Department of Justice. The Justice Department cites only one thing, an article in Psychology Today, a mass market magazine from 1986. It has no backup data. It has nothing in it that it cites. It's just 80%.
I began working in the field of treating sex offenders in 1978. When I started in the field, there was around 30 or 40 of us. We'd have a conference and we'd all attend and we'd all present. It was a very small world. I work with some of the most dangerous offenders, measuring their sexual response to what we call deviant stimuli with a device called a penile plethysmograph. So if they were getting aroused, we would give them a little shock.
If they were getting aroused, we gave them a little shock. That is what's known as a penile plethysmograph. They actually put something on the penis of the male that senses when it is engorged with blood, when the penis itself becomes erect. They use that to say that you were stimulated by the deviant stimuli. So they may show you a picture of a child in a sexual situation. And if that arouses you, then they can detect that with this measuring tool, and then they will give you an electric shock to try to break that pattern of response. So instead of seeing that kind of picture with that child in that sexual situation and being aroused by it, I will then switch that over to associating it with an electric shock, with a negative reinforcement, and hopefully that breaks the pattern of my being aroused by that. It is barbaric, it is inhumane, it is absolutely unconstitutional. I could not disagree with it more strongly as a practice. However, it used to be cutting edge technology and treatment for sex offenders, and they would try to say it had all this success and all of these things, despite how barbaric it is. Go ahead.
Why don't those people try to have possession of child pornography?
Because I don't know what type of stimuli they're actually presenting to the patient. So first of all, there may be an exception for using it in a clinical setting. Think about it like if you're studying anatomy. If you want to be a pediatrician, you have to understand the child's body, and you would have textbooks that show what the different stages of maturity are for both the penis and the vagina as a child ages into adolescence and then adulthood. So there are circumstances when you kind of need that information, or that you're using it for a purpose that isn't necessarily bad. So it may be given an exception. I don't know. It's a great question. Your head's in exactly the right place.
We're highly criticized for what we were doing. We were compared to a Clockwork Orange. We wrote an article for Psychology Today that described what we were doing. In that context, we felt it important to say the studies all over the country that have been published to date, this is back in the 80s, ranged from very low to very high recidivism rates, as high as 80%. That got taken to say all sex offenders recidivate at 80%. That's absolutely incorrect. It's wrong.
So he's the guy that wrote the article that said the 80% that the Supreme Court cites in all of its examples of imposing harsh sentences on sex offenders. And he says, that's not what I said. That's not right. It's factually inaccurate. And now today we have better data than that. He's going to get into that. So I want to make sure that we understand that we're getting this message straight from the horse's mouth. This is the guy who said 80% that the Supreme Court is using.
That's not true. If you're going to base laws at a federal level, you don't cite popular psychology magazines, no matter who the author is, me or anybody else. It's not a scientific journal. I'm appalled that this could happen. This is not my intent. Not my intent at all.
In 1988, I was given an assignment by my employer to research sex offender programs around the country. I couldn't find any, so basically I just made up a model. My original research paper had 6 references, including the dictionary and the paper that Rob Longo did for Psychology Today. The best we were doing was just making a bunch of guesses, but it's there now. There is hardcore scientifically based research.
The recidivism of sex offenders has been studied over and over and over again. One of the most comprehensive studies of recidivism found a recidivism rate among those almost 10,000 sex offenders of 3.5%. There's a study in Maine that had a rearrest rate of 3.9%. A Nebraska study found a 2-year recidivism rate of 1.7%. 1-year recidivism, 0.6%.
So there's several different ways to break out recidivism. It can be a rearrest for anything. You were convicted of a sex offense, but you ran a red light. That can be counted as recidivism, depending on how you're cutting the numbers. It can also be for a new sex crime. So you did this and then you got released and then you did the same thing again. There's a couple different ways. They're kind of blurring the lines here in this a little bit, but just understand that it kind of doesn't matter how you cut the numbers. The recidivism is next to nothing.
These studies are quite consistent. Criminals of other sorts, property crimes, drug crimes, have higher recidivism rates than sex offenders.
Why would you go to the first things that were ever written when there have been thousands and thousands of articles written since that time? That is deliberate indifference.
There's no doubt that the statements about reoffense rates are wrong. They're just, as a matter of social science fact, those statements are wrong.
At this point, the phrase frightening and high has been cited in close to 100 cases. Legislatures routinely recite it in their preambles to their legislation. They cite to the U.S. Supreme Court, which rested its assumptions on nothing.
We've designed these draconian sex offender laws, telling ourselves that the people who are affected by these laws are monsters, the other. The reality is these laws, by severely limiting the ability of offenders to get housing, to get jobs, they're undercutting the ability of the society to reintegrate sex offenders and prevent future sexual violence.
You are now classified as a sex offender. You have been kicked out of college. You're not allowed to use the internet. You're not allowed to live with your dad because he lives too close to a school. Do you think that the punishment fit the crime?
You're throwing thousands of people onto the streets, out of their houses, out of schools, based on frightening and high, decades of recidivism, 80%, which came from nothing.
What they're saying is they're very dangerous, they're gonna hurt us. This fear is exactly the source of these policies about public parks, about libraries, about residency restrictions.
It should be worrisome to all of us to see the protections of the Constitution cast aside because today we're frightened. The question is, what kind of measures do you take to secure yourself against these risks? And at what cost to your society and your values as a society?
Some fantastic reporting by the New York Times in that situation, in my opinion. Any questions?
So I feel like there's two ends of the spectrum. There are people who, get sentenced for way longer than they should. There are 8-year-olds who are getting charged with stuff like that. And then there are also, like, especially a lot today, more people are coming forward where there's, college boys who are getting raped and that sort of stuff, and then they're getting off with probation or community service, like something super simple where they should be charged higher. Obviously, like you said, this is just your opinion, it's not a professional opinion or anything, but how would you try to close that gap and find a more middle ground for the two extremes?
Equitable accountability across all of our government systems. Without that, anywhere, it can't be equitable. You can't say that the system is equitable unless it's equitable everywhere. So the military is a great example of that. Ladies are getting raped in our military at insane rates, and the reporting mechanisms disincentivize the commanding officer from handling it appropriately, reporting it to their superior, having them face military punishment in the military courts. And what do we do about it? I don't know. I've been at the Capitol hundreds of times since I got out in 2015 yelling about we need to improve this system. And everything that I've seen over the last 6 years and change now, we're moving in the wrong direction. That's one of the reasons that I give talks like these, is because we have legislators out there saying we need new laws, we need a new Megan's Law, we need a new Jacob Wetterling Act, we need new things to make this stuff illegal, when it already is, and we're not even equitably enforcing the laws that already exist. We have people in positions of power that are getting away with egregious crimes, and then we also have to just kind of acknowledge that there is no perfect system that can exist. You can't build a system that's going to catch every crime. You can't do it. There's always going to be somebody that gets away with it. So then when you do catch somebody, that's why what Judge Leonardo was saying is so poignant. Then they just throw the book at you and give you 290 years to try to scare everybody else. They try to use that as the replacement for actual systems of accountability. So then it becomes this fear-mongering of throwing the book at people, and then what the New York Times was talking about. Just say that recidivism is frightening and high. These people are going to get out there, just going to wreak havoc through our communities, when really the true numbers are all under 5%. I don't have a better answer to your question than that. I wish I did.
Thank you. We had one submitted that said, I think they're trying to say basically like, so society as a whole like sees sex offender and thinks one thing, sort of, how was it entering the prison system and that way? Did that label create any dynamics there that you could?
Sure. That's an important point that I overlooked. So, In Arizona, this isn't true everywhere. When you're sentenced for a sex crime, you will be in protective custody. There's a completely separate yard for snitches, gang members, people that just can't be in the general population. And in Arizona, there are 5 levels of prison yards. 5 is like supermax, 1 is like an elementary school, basically. A couple of fences around the outside, people live in the middle, but that some of them can come and go. Some of them can work on the outside while they're incarcerated there. If you're convicted of a sex offense, you will be on no lower than a level 3 yard. All protective custody yards are level 3, 4, or 5. So no matter what, you're going to start off in medium security and you can never go below that. On some of the yards there's programming and there's some things that are available. I tried to take advantage of as much of that as I could while I was in there. But one time I was walking to the class that I was supposed to be going to, and this guard stopped me and said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to my class." He's like, "No, where are you going?" I'm going to the class that I'm supposed to be at right now. No, where are you going? And I'm like, I don't understand. So I just stopped, kept my hands at my side, and just stood there. Because I knew I was on camera. I could tell she was trying to pull some weird stuff. And so I just stood there and did nothing. She tried to argue that I came at her like this. And I'm like, watch the video. Call up the supervisor, let's roll the tape. Show me that beautiful bean footage. Didn't matter. I got sent to solitary confinement for that. They were going to keep me in there for about a week and a half. And I said I'm not going to be on that yard anymore. So they offered me an opportunity to go back into the population. I said, no, I'm not staying on your yard. So they threw me back in the hole for another week or so, gave me another opportunity to come out. I said, nope, I'm not doing it. So they locked me back in there for a while, and eventually they moved me to another yard. So I was in solitary confinement over that for 21 days, which if you look at any international treaties, the Geneva Convention is obviously the go-to one for that basically says you have to provide standards of care that are at least this good if you're going to be incarcerating people, whether they be war criminals or whatever it may be, at least this. You can't do that much, you can't put somebody in solitary confinement for that long according to the Geneva Convention. I think this is 5 days. Anything more than 5 days is cruel and unusual punishment. So it just really gets into your head, it really messes with people. And it's one of the reasons why I was so adamant about not staying on that yard, because essentially, like basically the psychological warfare that's being used against the people that are there. That was a private prison. That's run by the GEO group, which I believe is a division of CCE. I could be wrong about that. But they make millions of dollars a year off of incarceration on private yards that are run by private companies. The rate of tickets that they write for people is, I don't know the exact number, but it's significantly higher than on state-run yards. So what they do is they'll write you tickets, as many as they can, for as many reasons as they can find, because the tickets take away your good time. So most people will, if you're sentenced to 5 years, you're really going to do about 85% of that time. Some states it's as low as 50. We've been trying to get it dropped down to 65 here for as long as I could remember. It's still 85 to my knowledge. So that last 15% of your time is what's known as your good time. They want to take as much of that as they can, because the more that they take, the longer you're there and the more dollars they get because you're in there per day. Let's cut some of those numbers.
I think you have a question.
Yeah.
Would you say that they give out tickets like probation, or like not probation officers, but just officers on in there? Do you think they give it out of fear or power? Because like would money would be higher up than them, so it would be power.
Yeah. I've received tickets for having my towel hanging over a thing where I was drying on. Basically, the foot of my bed, I had it hanging over there so it would dry. And I said, your towel's in the wrong place, you're getting a ticket. I know one day they wrote like some 600 tickets for shit like that. And it was just to try to chip away at people's good time, to try to get them to stay on the yard longer. That's just how it goes down.
Do you think they had favorites?
Yeah, I do. Because I know some guards that have slept with some people that are currently incarcerated. And also, when you're incarcerated on a yard, there's going to be what are known as heads. Every race will have its own different head, and that's the person who's deciding how everybody gets to act on the yard. So not only do you have the correctional staff and the rules that are imposed upon you by all of that, you also have your fellow inmates imposing a code of conduct on you separate from no snitching, don't do anything that's going to get us locked down, things like that. So yeah, there are definitely favorites, and it plays out in strange ways.
Did you have faith in any good of being in the system at all? Because like kind of everything surrounding kind of either cause everyone else to turn towards that path, I guess.
Yeah, that's hard to say. I don't think no, I lost hope. I absolutely lost hope, for sure. Hope that there is goodness in this world, hope that there's somebody out there that's looking to make sure that our civil rights are being upheld. That doesn't exist. I lost all faith in that.
You telling us like these experiences and the things that you knew when you were inside jail or prison, right?
Prison. Yeah, well, both.
How can the correction officers ever get held accountable for the things that they do in there?
I don't know. I really
There's,
don't.
No way at all.
So I was in jail once, and they came through and they did a search. They searched the entire pod, and they took us out of our cells and they put us in what was known as the rec room, but it wasn't outside. The entire time I was fighting my case, I was in 4th Ave. 10 months I went without seeing the sun. There's no rec yard, there's no going outside, there's none of that. You're locked in a room, and in that room there are cells that you stay in, and then kind of there's a common area, and then usually in the back corner they just kind of put an extra wall, and that's the rec room. And at the top, you know those glass blocks that are kind of fuzzy that you can't really see through? They use those to line the top of the walls there in that place. So you can see whether or not it is day outside, but you cannot see the sun. You can't make anything out. You can't tell if it's cloudy or nothing. You can just tell, is there light or not? 10 months I went without seeing the sun and going outside. It was absolutely psychological warfare, specifically designed to get me to sign a plea. It's my opinion, it's a strong one, but I think it holds.
That's true.
Any other, yeah?
Do you think there was ever like people who committed suicide there?
Oh, yeah, I've seen it on multiple occasions. On Christmas, so I got arrested, I got picked up just before Thanksgiving, so I'd been in there less than a month, and they started playing Christmas carols. Now, this is a story that I've not been able to verify or validate, but apparently some right-wing Christian conservative group said, these inmates, these poor lost souls, need to have the goodness of God, and we need to give them Christmas carols so that they can just be filled with that holiday spirit. They won their argument or whatever. So there was one CD that they put on. There's a TV in the pod, and they get to decide what's on it. So there's the state channel, and they played a Christmas CD. It was 12 songs, and they just played it on a loop all day, every day for weeks leading up to Christmas. I think they even played it like a couple days after Christmas. They were still playing it over and over and over again. Again, deliberate psychological warfare. We've done that to people when we were fighting wars and other, we've done this to people knowing the damage that it causes, and yet this is being allowed to happen in our correctional facilities. That's why I lost faith that there's anybody good looking out for our well-being. So while that CD thing was happening and it was playing over and over again, a little more context. In this pod, it's 15-man cells. So 2 floors of 4 cells. Each of the 4 cells holds about 15 people. So in the one, I was in the bottom left one, up and over one. There was a guy that was in there. His charges were really bad. I don't remember what it was. I think it was something with one of his kids. And he hung himself in that cell with 14 other people with him in that cell. There's nothing to hang yourself from. They specifically designed it so that you can't do that. So there was this little half wall with a post, and then the toilet's there, but then that part's just open. So around that little half wall, he tied his sheet. Then he tied it around his neck, and then he sat down, and his butt's only off the ground about this much. And he just closed off his carotid artery until he passed out. Then when he passed out and went limp, his body weight did the rest. So I watched them bring in the gurney. First of all, it took them a half an hour to get medical personnel in there. They heard us telling them that there was somebody that was hanging themselves in the cell up above, and they walked around. They didn't believe us. They thought, what, we're setting a trap for them or something? I don't know what they were thinking. But the response to that was one of the worst things I've ever seen while I was in there. It took him way too long to respond to anything like that. And that's another thing of the losing the faith, that my health, welfare, well-being, safety is not being looked out for by anybody. You would think the correction officers are there to make sure we don't hurt ourselves or each other. Clearly not the case. So I don't know why they're there, because they're not doing that. So let's talk about some of the numbers and the money, and then we'll get into some of the probation terms, then the polygraph exams, talk a little bit about what we can do about it, and then we'll get to a Q&A and we'll be done. Just a few things left. So the prison population has increased over 700% since the 70s. We have, in 2015, because a lot of the data on incarceration lags, we need a year or two to kind of process the data before we can say this many people or this percent of whatever. But in 2015, pretrial detainees were 74% of the total jail population in Arizona. So most of these people that are being held, 3/4 of them are pre-sentence. These are still people that fall under the category of innocent until proven guilty. And yet they're still incarcerated in cells that have no access to the outside. You can be locked in there for months without breathing fresh air. We spend over $1.3 billion annually to incarcerate about 35,000 people as we have right now. The total incarcerated population in Arizona is 2.3 million people. We account for about 5% of the global population, yet we are 25% of all of the incarcerated population across the planet. So the US is the #1 leader in incarceration. We incarcerate more people than anybody else on the planet. There's two ways that you look at that number, like the graph I showed you before, per capita. So that's how you adjust for disparities in the population. You have a lot of people, we only have a few people, so let's just look at the rate, the percentage of people. We'll compare that way, so you can compare apples to apples. But even if you don't want to do it that way, you just want to look at the total number of people incarcerated. Either way you cut the numbers, we're the top of the list. Arizona is the 4th most incarcerated state in the most incarcerated nation on the planet. Get out now while you can. Just kidding. What's your question?
So, okay, maybe just because I based it off of just the shows I watch, it's the only thing I really know, but don't they, like, if it gets overpopulated, or don't they just move you to like another state or another like jail or prison or anything? Like, could they do that? Would you get like lost in the system, or like how does that correlate within the states?
Yeah, there's actually a really bad problem right now with COVID where people are being held past their release date. There's several hundred people that are incarcerated right now in Arizona that fall into that category. There was a thing right before I was incarcerated, so 2005 to 2010, I would guess somewhere in there, they moved a bunch of Arizona people that were incarcerated to Texas because they were gonna house our people for cheaper or whatever. A lot of problems with that. One is that if your family wants to come visit you, now instead of having to drive to Florence, they've got to go to Texas. So a lot of complaints, a lot of problems and issues with that. Also, they moved them to substandard care. So the conditions under which they were being housed were worse in Texas than they were here. Why do you think they were saving so much money? Because they just weren't doing it right. So yes, that does happen. All right, so money. We spend $70 billion a year in the entire country on incarceration. 7.3 million people are on some form of supervision. This could be probation, parole, an ankle monitor, whatever it may be. Over 7 million people on that. So, some quick math. My probation fees monthly are $65. If you multiply that by the 7.3 million people that are being supervised, that's $474.5 million that they're getting from the people on probation, when these systems are supposed to be paid for by the taxpayers. Instead, they're forcing us to fund the system that is oppressing us. About 75% of all imprisonment spending happens at the state level. So you also have people that are charged with federal crimes. They're held in federal institutions. From my understanding, the standard of care there is higher because they follow all the bare minimums that are imposed upon them by the federal government, whereas the states find a way to kind of step through. The National Institute of Justice found that within 3 years of release, 67.8% of prisoners were rearrested. So that's that 2/3 recidivism rate, that's a rearrest rate, within 3 years. Now, I'm going to kind of jump ahead and then come back. How do we fix this? Well, what we found is that when inmates receive vocational training, their recidivism rate drops to 30%. So you can cut recidivism in half today by just teaching them how to do jobs when they come back out. It's that simple. Or you can educate them. If you get an associate's degree, your likelihood of recidivism drops to 13.7%. If you get a bachelor's degree, that drops to 5.6%. And if you get a master's degree, it's effectively zero. You effectively have a 0% recidivism rate if you just give them a master's degree. And not just hand it to them after, but you know what I mean. Oh, and according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, this is a division under the DOJ, the Department of Justice, they've showed that in 2001, again, this data lags, the cost per incarcerated individual, $22,500 every year. The tuition at New York, or at SUNY, New York State University of New York, is less than $8,000. So to educate them is cheaper than to incarcerate them, and you get better bang for your buck. All right, the conditions of probation, the sex offender addendum, total internet prohibition, the whole thing. Not allowed to use social media. You can't possess a smartphone, a tablet, any device that has the capacity to connect to the internet. This can be a Ring doorbell. This can be your printer that connects to Wi-Fi. This can be a smart thermostat, anything smart, a smart light bulb. Anything smart, not allowed to have. There's also a blanket restriction on pornography. Now, there are some issues with First Amendment rights on that. The courts have ruled that pornography is essentially First Amendment protected free speech. And they use the pornography restriction as the excuse for why they restrict the entire internet as a whole. Well, if they let them get online, they're just going to watch porn. So they restrict the whole thing, even with all the First Amendment implications that come along with that.
Is that probation exclusively related to sex offenses, or is that any probate?
This is specifically the sex offender addendum that's added onto the normal terms of probation. So it's a wholly separate thing just for sex offenders.
Okay. Is it for everybody on the sex offender registry, or just for the tier?
The registry is separate from probation. This is for probation. So this is something that you would either sign in your plea or that would get imposed after you lose at trial. That's just with probation. So if they had granted my early termination and let me off, I would be able to use social media and watch porn and do all these other things I'm about to talk about. Any other questions about? Yeah.
So everybody who committed a sex crime who is on probation will be like added to the sex offender addendum?
Yes, I don't know of any exceptions to that rule. I'm sure there's one, but I don't know of any of it. And they don't impose these terms, so it seems like when they were coming to the agreement of which terms to apply, it was kind of, feels to me like the background conversation was, okay, if your crime involved the internet, if you were luring minors in through Facebook, then after you come back out, you're not allowed to use Facebook. That's perfectly fine. But this blanket restriction on all internet, there was actually a case that did go to the Supreme Court. It's called Packingham versus North Carolina, where they determined that blanket prohibitions on the internet or social media burden more free speech than is necessary to further the legitimate goals of probation, which would be to not let that guy back on Facebook, that hypothetical guy I was talking about a second ago. It goes too far, and it burdens your free speech. It blocks your free speech. We are basically guaranteed the right to enter the public discussion, speak, hear a response, have time, and then be able to speak again. That's kind of what First Amendment protected free speech is. And Packingham versus North Carolina said that they're doing too much, yet these things are still being imposed on probationers in Arizona, regardless of Supreme Court verdicts that have been happening all around the country that say you can't do that. Arizona's still just doing it anyway, which is very frustrating.
So you can't have a cell phone the whole time of that period?
You would have to have a dumb phone. You couldn't have a smartphone. So because I started my own business, I got an exception. That's my smartphone right there that I'm using to record my lecture. I am allowed to have that, but I'm not allowed to use it to get onto social media. So I can't have Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, any of that. Even though I have those profiles for my business, I have to have somebody else manage the content that is put out on those. I'm not allowed to directly interact with that, even for just my business, not whatever my personal statement may be. Not allowed to have any minor contact, whether it's your own child or not. If you get in line at the grocery store and a lady with her 4 kids gets in line behind you, technically you're supposed to leave. Now, a lot of probation officers have kind of come down on how strict they are on that, where, okay, you don't have to leave, but you have to report it. I was in line at the grocery store, a lady with kids, I'm telling you. And then they go, okay. And they make a note of it. And then that comes up on your polygraph later, which we're almost there on the polygraph stuff, I promise. So then when you get to the polygraph, they say, okay, except for the kid that came behind you in line in the store and the other kid that bumped into you and whatever, have you had any minor contact that's unreported? Anything else is basically what the polygraph question would be. So that's why, as a probationer, it is a good idea to say, yeah, that kid bumped into me in line, I was stuck in line at the grocery store, I couldn't get away, somebody else came in, whatever it may be. Whatever the circumstance is, it is to your advantage to disclose that to your probation officer. One, because they're not just going to violate you the first time you were in proximity with a minor, but also because it builds trust and it will work for you on the polygraph. The other thing that comes along with that sex offender addendum is the mandate for therapy and treatment, which you have to take. I call them the thought police. It took me about 5 years to get through that program, and that's the fastest that I've ever heard of anybody getting through treatment or therapy. If you know of one other guy that completed his in 9 months, and his probation officer and surveillance officer and the probation supervisor had a staffing with him and his treatment provider and said, I don't think so. This guy's going back into treatment. 9 months isn't enough, even though the therapist was saying he completed the curriculum. There were like 4 people in our class. He presented work every day when he was in. He blew through it. Like, he did the work. And they still said, nope, not good enough. You got to go back in for more time. I know people that have been in treatment and therapy for more than 13 years. I've completed my work in 5. What's the cost of therapy? $45 a week. It's weekly therapy, $45 every session, even if you miss. So the total financial cost, we've got the probation fee of $65 a month. At 6.5 years, that's about $5,000. Weekly therapy, $45 a week, 5 years, that's $11,700. The annual polygraph costs are about $225. If you fail that and have to do a retake, it's a more expensive test. That's about $285. Restitution is another financial imposition that comes out of your sentencing, whatever you owe to the victim for committing your crime. In my case, there was none. It always varies. No two are the same. So with all of that added together, you're talking about $3,345 per year that it costs to be on probation and in therapy. We talked about killing your number and going back, and if you want to, the location restrictions, just places that you're not allowed to go for that are part of the addendum. Churches, malls, parks. Now don't just think of the park in the middle of your neighborhood. Think of a state park. That would include Lake Pleasant. That would include going camping. That would include anything that could qualify as a park. Concerts, movies, anything that's determined to be an event, you're not really allowed to go to. Bowling alley. The library is specifically prohibited. I am not allowed to go to a library. Restaurants that cater to children, so obviously Chuck E. Cheese and things like that would be prohibited. I don't disagree with that. I think that's right, but I think a lot of the other ones are wrong. Schools, not allowed to go to a school, not even to drop off or pick up your own kids. Can't take them to daycare. That is, if you're even allowed to be around your children. And any adult venues. Strip clubs, Castle Boutique, Fascinations, trails, massage parlors, and for a lot of people, even bars. There is a box that they have to actively check to say that you're not allowed to drink any alcohol. I think they forgot to check that in my case, because I don't have an alcohol restriction. I think it was simply that they overlooked it. I don't think they were saying, oh, you can just drink if you want to. I don't think it was a conscious decision. I think it was an oversight. And you got to stay within the county. Now you got to think, you guys are lucky enough to be in Maricopa County, 4th largest, 5th largest in the country. But think if you're in Tucson. If you're in Tucson, you can't even get out of Tucson. So they won't let you cross tribal land because of the agreement with however the treaties work with the federal versus the states. So if you can't be on a reservation and your city is surrounded by reservations, how are you supposed to get out? And this is what Tucson essentially is. So I know people that are like, yeah, you can go up to Phoenix. Yeah, but I can't get through. I can't get through. I can't. So I know people that would be doing advocacy work up in here and telling their story and giving their testimony at the state capitol and whatnot. They can't do that because they're not allowed to be here. You can't get through to get here. Ankle monitors, depends case by case. It can be for the duration of probation. I do know somebody that has an ankle monitor that will be on for the duration of their lifetime probation. Can't get the ankle monitor off unless they can get off of their probation entirely. Housing, you have to get that pre-approved. And you may also be on the map with the red dots. You can look up where sex offenders in my neighborhood, so you may be there. So there's all kinds of housing issues there. Employment, you would be restricted to non-customer facing jobs. No retail, not working in a restaurant as a waiter, none of that. So you'd be in construction, doing call centers, manufacturing, warehouse jobs, things like that. And you're unlikely to qualify for any kind of license or permit or certification that you would get. Can't get your real estate license, can't get anything that would be required for a specialized vocation, not gonna be allowed to get it.
So I just have a business that's like a glass company that specifically hires, well, like even the owner is someone who was convicted, so like specifically try to hire people like that, but they need their fabrication like, license or something to do that. Does that fall underneath that? Cause I know that.
It's a very specific question. There are probably ways to get around it for something like that. It's a very specific thing. You can pretty easily show that that's not a risk to the rest of the community at large. So that's something that you'd probably be able to do. Almost everything that I'm saying today has an exception, just about everything. But in general, you're gonna be restricted from almost every kind of license. Like I got my Microsoft Office certification, so you can do tech support for Microsoft Office. So there are some that you can get, but like the real estate license is the easiest one to understand. Like you're obviously just not gonna be able to go to empty houses and be alone with other random people in those empty houses. Like that's kind of, but everything else in the middle is gray area, and it's really case by case. And it's not just the licensing authority that can decide. Your probation officer can also say, no, you're not allowed to do that. They can impose, there's a condition on everybody's probation. This isn't just the sex offender addendum that states that, basically says, and anything else that your probation officer says.
Does your probation officer like know you truly, or is it sometimes that they just kind of pick up the case and go off what the written words are?
Exactly that. And sometimes not even that. Sometimes you'll move to somebody else's caseload and they won't really even give you a second look. They'll wait a couple of months before they really dig in and see who are you, what are you about. They'll feel you out a couple of times first. That's why it's so hard when you move from one probation officer to another, because it's a really hard reset button. Yeah, but my last probation officer said that I can do this and this, and I'm saying that you can't anymore. They'll take away permissions that were granted to you by previous POs, which is why my big piece of advice for anybody on probation is if you get permission to do something, get it in writing, because otherwise it carries zero weight. Anybody else with any questions while we're in the middle of this? Cool, just a couple more here. So your employment restrictions. So you're also going to have a surveillance officer. They can come up, they can show up to your house whenever they want, your house, your job, wherever you are, they can come find you, make you show them your phone. They can read through all your messages, ask about your contacts, who's this person, why are you talking about this? They can come to your house, open the closet, search through everything, tell you to get rid of stuff that they don't think you should have. They can give you breathalyzer tests right in the middle of your job, right in front of all your coworkers if they want. I had a PO once send me into my job with a letter that enumerated my crimes, and I had to get the manager to sign it. And I brought it to him, and he said, yeah, we got a lot of people that work here with the background. It's not really that big of a deal. Here you go. I said, thank God, I was so worried. Went back to my desk, started banging the phone again, grinding, trying to get my sales. 2 hours later, hey, Dustin, you're fired. Bye. So it can play out in so many ways. And I had another PO since then try to send me into another job with a letter similar to that, and I refused. And it was a very difficult fight because I held my ground. And I basically said, if you're going to violate me on this, cool, let's go. I'm in. Because I'm not doing that again. I've had as many as 10 jobs a year. I had 3 different companies offer me a promotion, and instead of promoting me, they fired me. Now, I would always disclose my background in the first interview. If this is going to be a problem, let's make it a problem right now. I don't want to get your training packet, have you make me a name tag, whatever it is, just to have you be like, wait, I didn't know that you were a whatever, and fired me. I would throw it out on the table first thing. Didn't matter. I would get offered a promotion I'd put in for it, HR would look over and be like, oh yeah, this guy, wait, what's this? Not only can we not promote this guy, he shouldn't even be working here in the first place. You gotta fire him. So I've had other people step in and just fire me just for looking, just looking it over, just seeing it at face value. Yeah. So all of these restrictions and rules on the sex offender addendum you can be granted exceptions to them by your probation officer, but it has to be case by case. So if I wanted to go camping, I can ask my probation officer, can I leave the county? Can I go to a park? Can I do, all the things that would normally violate as terms of my probation? Think of a funeral. You're gonna have kids there, you're gonna have, right, you're not gonna have super control over the whole thing. So you would get permission and they would either let you or not. I had to go through the supervisor to get permission to go to my own father's funeral at the end of 2019 after, it was leukemia. And towards the end, I switched probation officers. I was going up to see my dad in Prescott Valley every weekend. They were letting me go. Then I got a new probation officer. You're not allowed to leave the county. Yeah, but I've been going every week. Yeah, but you're new. I'm not new, I've been doing this for years. Yeah, but you're new to us. So they would refuse to let me go. So I wasn't able to see my dad, and then, except for the day that they took him to the hospital. By the time I got there, he was already unconscious. Never woke up again from that. Luckily, I was there when he actually passed. I held his hand while he was passing, but, and then through the supervisor, I was able to go to the funeral. But the PO wasn't gonna let me go. She was not gonna let me go to that funeral. There's gonna be kids there, we can't, all of it. Let's talk about polygraphs. So the polygraph is kind of the answer to the question, just get a smartphone and hide it from them. Just go to the funeral, how are they gonna know? Just go do the thing and don't tell them. How will they know? Well, they'll know because every year they give you a polygraph test. It costs $225. They ask you 3 questions. It's usually 3 questions specifically related to your case. So other than all these kids that you told us about that you bumped into in the grocery stores or anything else, have you watched any pornography? And have you had a sexual partner that you haven't told us about? If I wanted to have a girlfriend and get into an intimate relationship with somebody, I would have to ask my PO and get permission for that first before I entered into the relationship with her. So that's fun. I've been single for about 3 years now. But my last girlfriend tried to kill me with her car. So I was the victim of an attempted murder, and I was charged with a domestic violence. Luckily, I was able to beat that and get those charges dropped. But because of it, my PO made me take anger management classes. And the prosecutor cited that as the reason to not let me off of probation when I filed for my ET. I'm like, okay, let's hang on a second here. I was the victim in this domestic violence situation. They just see a guy in a DV and they're like, nope, not happening. The polygraph test was invented by a man named William Martin Molston. Anybody recognize that name? He invented the Wonder Woman comic strip with her lasso of truth that she wraps around you. And what do you got to do? Tell the truth. You can't lie. How is that different from a blood pressure cuff and interrogation? The first polygraph tests were done with only a blood pressure cuff. Now they use, they measure the electroconductivity of your skin, which measures basically how much you're sweating. They measure your respiration rate, so they wrap straps around your chest, 2 of them. They got pads under your butt and under your feet that measure if you're clenching or moving. They use that to try to see if you're using countermeasures. So if I try to clench up when I'm lying and relax when I'm telling the truth or whatever, if you try to do anything like that to try to cheat the system, they have these extra sensors to measure all of that. And the blood pressure cuff they still use. the scientific justification. Why do we use a polygraph test? Who says that a polygraph test works? There's something known as the Nelson Report. This is on the American Psychiatric, the APA website. They, even their own data shows that at best, the polygraph is 85% effective. So we have over 2 million polygraph tests that are administered every year. If no better than 85% of them are accurate, then we have hundreds of thousands of polygraph tests that are giving us false results that we're using to say, well, thank God, we gave that guy a polygraph test and he passed it, so now we know that he's not out there recidivating and whatever. They use it as a false security blanket when it is entirely unreliable. So it's not just one or the other, it's not just false positives, it's not just false negatives, it's just false. It's just, they're wrong and they're barbaric. The FBI and the CIA actively acknowledge that the polygraph test is an advanced interrogation technique. They deliberately use this to try to get you to confess. Yeah, you're right. It's called polydumping. We even have a word for it. When you polydump, you go in and you go, yeah, I know I only told you about the one kid that I bumped into the grocery store, but my sister came over with my nephew and I just had to give him a big old hug and I never told anybody and I feel so bad. And you dump all this stuff that you've done. Oh yeah, I also had this girlfriend that I never told you about and I feel bad about it. And then you dump all that and the polygrapher writes it all down and then they give you the test and they say, with the exception of everything else that you told us before and just told us, is there anything else? And that's how they leverage the polygraph test to force a confession from you. If you realize that's what they're doing, it doesn't work. It's simply acknowledging and realizing that that is the paradigm that helps you to overcome it. So we know that the health impacts of this isolation are more detrimental to a person's health than smoking or obesity. They have something called all-cause mortality. All of the different ways that you can die. If you're in this category versus this category, how often do you show up when you kind of just look at all the numbers? And it's the health impacts carry across all-cause mortality. If you are isolated, you are more likely to die from any and every cause than if you're not isolated. If you do have healthy social interactions, connections, relationships. So by restricting these people from the parks, the malls, the movie theaters, and the libraries, forcing them into isolation is actively killing them. No other way to cut those numbers. So just a few quotes from a few things, and then we'll get into your questions. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. That is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was assassinated by white supremacists. I think that just kind of further validates his point. Another one in the same vein is denying any group of citizens their civil, constitutional, or human rights threatens the liberties of us all. Gandhi once said, the true measure of any society can be found in how it treats its most vulnerable members. It's systematic oppression is what he's speaking of there. There's another quote. Anybody know Ayn Rand or the book Atlas Shrugged? Familiar with the author? A few of you? Good. So in Atlas Shrugged, there's a quote kind of towards the end that I'm going to read. It's about a paragraph, but I really feel like it drives the point home. There's no way to rule innocent men. The only power any government has is the power to crack down on criminals. Well, when there aren't enough criminals, one makes them. One declares so many things to be a crime that it becomes impossible for men to live without breaking laws. Who wants a nation of law-abiding citizens? What's there in that for anyone? But just pass the kind of laws that can neither be observed nor enforced or objectively interpreted, and you create a nation of lawbreakers, and then you cash in on guilt. Now that's the system, Mr. Reardon, that's the game, and once you understand it, you'll be much easier to deal with. My last point is my ask. You all obviously have an interest in criminal justice. When reforms are being passed, when new legislation comes before the legislature that's going to help reform our system, they always include a clause at the end that says, this will apply to everyone except for violent offenders and sex offenders. We deserve meaningful criminal justice reform just as much as anybody else. Yes, my crime was awful. I used a disparity in power to manipulate and get what I wanted. And that was wrong and inappropriate, and I served my time, and I understand that it is wrong, and even without having served my time, I never would have done anything like it again, because immediately after the fact, the guilt, oh wow, I really just crossed a line here, this is really, really bad, I can never put myself in a situation like this ever again. Most would think that that foresight should have been there before, and I don't disagree. But it wasn't, and it doesn't mean that we can just keep throwing people away, locking them up, throwing away the key, forgetting about their human rights, forgetting about the values and the principles that we profess to uphold and have as a nation, except for this guy. Not him. He doesn't get them. If you move forward through your education and your career and work in reform, please include everyone. That is my talk, and I am now happy to answer all of your questions. Great timing. So before I get to the list, if you submitted a question, it's in here, I'm going to get to it. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask straight off? Go for it.
So my question for you is, based on your company, all of the employees, do they have to tell their PO officers that they're in contact with the public every day when they're working for you, or do they get permission to do that before?
Yeah, I got permission from Cynthia Stevens, who is the supervisor of probation. My mom co-owns the business with me, and she is also my chaperone. I didn't even get into what a chaperone means. Somebody who is a trusted person that probation approves, that says they're in your life, and if you do something bad, we think they'll tell us, so that we can make sure that you're not a continued danger to public safety. So I had the conversation with her and got approved for the business to operate as, I basically had the whole business plan written up, and she said, yes, I will approve that. So now what's nice is that I don't really have to get that kind of permission from my probation officer anymore, because I got it from the supervisor. So I kind of went over heads to do it, and probably made an enemy or two along the way. But yes, anybody that's interacting with, see, here's the thing, the nice thing about this is that they're gonna be in the trailer. So if I was at a cash register in a store, I can just come out from around the register and I'm right next to you. Whereas I'm literally locked in a box, I would have to come out of the trailer and come out to speak with you. So it's just that little bit of a difference can be enough between, no, you're not allowed to do that, and yeah, okay, that'll be fine.
Going off the chaperone thing, so say if somebody who was with their chaperone did something that was bad and the chaperone did not report it, would they also be in trouble for it? Like if it were to be found out?
They would, the worst that probation could do to them is revoke their chaperone status, unless they actually committed a crime. But if they just violated something in that contract with probation, there, to my knowledge, are no criminal penalties that they could impose. All right.
We have about 10 minutes or so.
Sounds
So
great.
that's it.
What's the idea behind Justice Strava? Why cold brew and not something else? I love coffee. Got fired from too many jobs. Caffeine is addictive. It was effective, and my coffee's good. I always made great coffee. When I was on the inside, all you get is instant coffee. It's garbage. So when I got out, one of the highest value experiences for me was that first delicious cup of coffee that I had, because I missed it so much. And that carried through. If I had any advice for a former inmate losing hope in securing employment, what would it be? Keep trying. I mean, you gotta think, I said I had as many as 10 jobs a year. How many do you think I applied to? Hundreds. It is simply a numbers game. It's endurance. This whole thing is an endurance test. You have to endure longer and better than a system. I don't have to outlast you. I've got to outlast ASU or, right, like the entire justice system. So you're going up against something where the deck is stacked against you, and you've got to step into it. You can't run from it. Otherwise, go back and kill your number. That sucks too. I think going back and killing your number sucks way more than fighting to try to get through to do the right thing. And since I got fired from so many of those jobs, and since I realized all the garbage that people have to go through to maintain stable employment, I figured if I'm gonna build my own company, I'm gonna make it a place for other people like me to be able to thrive and survive. So in getting the trailer up and running, I hired several formerly incarcerated people to help me. When I got that trailer, it was a nightmare. I imported it from overseas. All the wiring was garbage. It just had so many problems. And I literally had to build it from the ground up. The wheels and axles came inside the trailer. I had to build everything underneath it. I had to do the whole thing. So I hired some people that were formerly incarcerated to come out and help me with that. I knew a guy that was an electrician. He's formerly incarcerated. While he was down, he got cracked in the head, lost a lot of his cognitive abilities, but that man knew electrical. Whatever part of his brain was storing that was unaffected. He was an amazing electrician. I paid him what he was worth. I could have paid him half of that and he still would have said thank you to me. But I paid him what he was worth because I felt like it was the right thing to do. And I hope that more people take that as an example and try to do that. The backlash, a lot of people ask about backlash. I don't get any backlash. Actually, I had my first person that I saw a couple of days ago. I've been doing this about 2 years now. Hear what I was saying with another customer about reforms and walk away. This is the worst that's happened in 2 years. I've had somebody walk away before they even came up to ask me for a cup of coffee. The backlash is not there. People get it. The jig is up. The game is over. People realize that the system is not working for anybody. I don't care if you're a right wing and you're just looking at the money. I don't care if you're left wing and you're looking at how we're actually treating people. Again, it should be more about love or what. I don't care what your perspective is. If you're a flower child and a hippie, or if it doesn't matter. Everybody's frustrated with the system for one reason or another because it's so obviously not working. People do deserve second chances. A lot of people end up back incarcerated. Do I feel like as a result that damages my image of what my company stands for? This is a very important question. Does anybody know who Willie Horton is? They passed a reform. Willie Horton was released. He had been sentenced for murder. He committed a murder, and because of a reform, he got released. And when he got released, he came back out, and guess what? Killed somebody. Man, the opposite party used that to their advantage in every political ad. They said this guy's name so many times. This is why we have to be tough on crime. This is why we can't reform the system. Because look at what happened with Willie Horton. But what they're missing is that there will always be a Willie Horton. You can't refuse to reform the system just because you know a couple of people in that reform are going to recidivate and commit a new egregious crime. You can't just lock everybody down because of one idiot. I feel like there are so many examples of this all across society where one idiot ruins it for everybody. It's why speed limits are so low. It's why it's all over the place. Anywhere you look, you see it. One dumb idiot can't ruin it for everybody anymore. I'm sorry, it's not gonna fly. Biggest challenge on my journey, myself, me. Yeah. A lot of having to get out of my own way, a lot of having to rise above in situations that I disagreed with, a lot of holding my tongue when I want to say what I really want to say to my probation officer. It's me. It's me. How did you decide you wanted to change your life after you were convicted of your charges? So that's the thing, I knew right after the fact that I would never do anything like that again. So even though a year later I was arrested and went through all that, I was never fighting my case on the merits. I was just fighting for something equitable. Just make the punishment fit the crime. Like, I'm not gonna recidivate, I'm not going anywhere, I'm not leaving. I've been in this state my whole life. Like, let's just be fair about it. And I never found that fairness.
Probably have time for like one or two more maybe.
Sure.
Anyone know of a question that they asked? They don't feel like
This
they
is a
answered?
good one that I
Okay.
highlighted that
Go
I
ahead,
really want
yeah.
to get to. So
Yeah.
how were you in contact with a high school girl in that capacity as a senior in college? When it was winter break, I had a friend let me move in with them. That friend had a niece who would come over to babysit their kids, went from there. And the question about Terrence Slater is a really good one too. So solitary confinement leaves an impact on an inmate's life even when he's a free man. How long do you think it took Terrence Slater to not be afraid of crowds or being around the general public? It never goes away. I guarantee you he still feels that today. It's just easier to overcome, rise above. You get better at overcoming it. It doesn't get easier. Anybody else really had a question that they wanted to hear me answer tonight?
Yeah.
I really appreciate all of your time.